All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're all about getting you up to speed quickly on the stuff that really matters. And today we're going to dive into a topic that's, well, it might not be on your radar every time you're at the airport.
Yeah, not exactly the first thing you think about when you're rushing to catch a flight.
Right. But it's actually super important when it comes to, making sure your flight actually takes off and lands safely. We're talking about how airports manage the risks that wildlife can pose. I mean, birds, deer, you name it, they're all hanging around
Mm.
and they can cause some serious trouble.
Oh, absolutely. And to really get into the nitty-gritty of this, we've got a really interesting research article to guide us today. It's called Wildlife Hazard Management, an intuitive web-based risk matrix for airport stakeholders. And it digs deep into how data analysis and visualization can help airports get a handle on these wildlife hazards.
So we're going to try to unpack this, pull out the most important bits, and maybe even uncover a few surprises along the way. Like how often do these incidents actually happen? What are the biggest risks? And how are airports using technology to keep everything running smoothly?
Yeah, let's break it down.
Okay, so think about it. When you're at the airport, you're usually focused on getting through security, finding your gate, grabbing a snack, the usual airport stuff. But while all that's happening, there's a whole other world buzzing around just outside, literally.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about the other passengers sharing the airspace.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about a few pigeons here and there. In 2019 alone, there were over 17,000 reported cases of wildlife striking aircraft in the U.S. And get this, between 1990 and 2019, that number balloons to over 227,000. That's a lot of close calls.
Wow, that's a pretty staggering figure. It really highlights how persistent this issue is for airports.
It really does. And while birds are definitely the usual suspects, it's not just them. Other animals, like deer, can also cause major problems. And what's crazy is how these incidents, which might seem minor, can sometimes lead to some pretty scary situations. I mean, remember that Miracle on the Hudson incident back in 2009? U.S. Airways Flight 1549?
Oh, yeah, I remember that. That was a pretty dramatic example of what can happen when birds hit an aircraft's engines.
Exactly. So during takeoff, the plane hit a flock of birds and both engines failed. The pilot, Chesley Sullenberger, had to make an emergency landing in the Hudson River. Luckily, everyone survived, but it was a huge wake-up call for the aviation industry about the very real dangers of wildlife strikes.
Right. It really brought the potential severity of these incidents into the spotlight, and it probably significantly shaped how the industry approaches this risk.
Oh, it definitely did. And these types of incidents don't just happen at big airports either. Even smaller airports have to deal with this all the time. Like back in 2016 at Lancaster Airport in Philadelphia, a Beechcraft aircraft had a run-in with a deer right on the runway.
Oh, wow. A deer on the runway. That's not something you see every day.
Yeah, it caused some damage to the plane, and they had to make an emergency landing. So, it's clear that managing wildlife risks is a big deal for airports of all sizes. It's not just a concern for those giant hubs.
Absolutely. And that's probably why the focus has really shifted towards being proactive about managing these hazards, rather than just reacting to them after something happens.
Right, so it's all about prevention. And speaking of being proactive, here in the U.S., we've got an FAA regulation, 14 CFR 139.337, that mandates airports to not only report every single wildlife strike.
Everyone, wow.
Yep, every single one. But they also have to go a step further and actually create and implement these comprehensive wildlife hazard management plans. It's about identifying potential problems and then figuring out ways to, reduce the chances of anything bad happening so they're not just sitting around waiting for something to happen.
So it's a two-pronged approach, reporting and planning. And that reporting aspect must generate a ton of data. How do they keep track of it all?
That's a great question. So for starters, airports use this specific form, FAA Form 5200-7, to document every single wildlife strike. It's super detailed, too.
Makes sense. They need to capture all the important details.
Right, like what kind of animal it was, when and where it happened, the phase of flight, the whole 9 yards. And on top of that, pilots are also asked to submit reports through the FAA's online system.
So they have multiple ways to gather information and ensure nothing slips through the cracks.
Exactly. They're really trying to build as complete a picture as possible.
Which makes you wonder, how do they actually use all that data? I mean, beyond simply keeping count, how does it inform the safety procedures?
That's a great question, and it actually ties into a significant shift in how the aviation industry thinks about safety overall. You see, back in 2010, there was this important piece of legislation passed the Airline Safety and Federal Aviation Administration Extension Act.
Okay, I see where this is going. This was a major push for a more standardized and systematic approach to safety, right?
You got it. This act made it mandatory for airlines to set up these things called safety management systems, or SMS for short. Think of them as these comprehensive frameworks for identifying and managing risks, making sure everything is as safe as possible.
So instead of just reacting to incidents, they're building a culture of proactive safety management.
Right. And it wasn't just for the airlines. The FAA followed up with an order that basically extended the requirement for safety risk management, which is it's a key part of SMS that focuses specifically on risks like wildlife encounters.
So SMS is the umbrella, and SRM is like a specific tool under that umbrella designed to tackle risks like these wildlife strikes.
Exactly. And this SRM requirement, they rolled it out to airports in phases, starting with the big hub airports in 2011, and eventually covering all airports, even the smaller ones, by 2014. It was a big change.
It seems like a robust system on paper. Everyone's reporting incidents, analyzing the data, developing these safety plans. But the research we're looking at points out that there were some challenges when it came to actually using this system effectively, especially the risk matrix part.
Yeah, you're right. They had the guidelines, but putting it into practice wasn't always straightforward.
So what was the main sticking point? Was it collecting the data, analyzing it, or something else entirely?
Well, the biggest challenge was that even though the basic idea of a risk matrix is pretty simple, figuring out how likely something is to happen and how bad it would be if it did.
Yeah, it sounds straightforward enough.
In reality, airport managers often struggled to consistently and objectively figure out the actual level of risk a particular wildlife species posed. Like, is a flock of geese a bigger threat than a few pigeons? And how do you quantify that?
Right. Translating those general guidelines into concrete numbers for specific situations, that's where things get tricky.
Exactly. So to help with this, in 2015, the Transportation Research Board introduced this thing called the Advanced Wildlife Hazard Management Risk Assessment Tool, which, thankfully, they shortened to WAMRAT.
WAMRAT. Okay, I like it. Catchy. So this tool was designed to make the risk assessment process more, I don't know, less subjective, more standardized.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
WAMRAT brought more standardization, especially to the severity side of the equation. It basically gave predefined severity scores for different types of wildlife based on their size. So a tiny mouse would get a low score, because even if it gets sucked into an engine, it's not going to cause much damage. But a big bird, like a goose, well, that has the potential to really mess things up.
Makes sense. It's about assigning a number that reflects the potential consequences of a strike, helping to make the assessment less reliant on individual judgment.
Exactly. And this system, it covered a huge range of animals, from little rodents and bats to large water birds and even things like deer. It was pretty comprehensive. But even with this, there was still a significant limitation.
Ah, so there was still a piece of the puzzle missing.
Yeah, the tricky part was figuring out the likelihood part of the risk equation. How probable was a wildlife strike in the first place? That often came down to, well, the airport manager's best guess, which could be pretty subjective.
I see. So you could have a high severity hazard like a flock of large birds, but if the manager felt that the chances of them being near the runway were low, the overall risk assessment might be skewed.
Exactly. And you have to remember, we're talking about a lot of wildlife encounters here. The USDA estimates that there are about 38 reported wildlife strikes to the FAA every single day, and about 97% of those involve birds. So getting a handle on the likelihood part of the risk is super important.
38 a day.
Why?
That's a pretty constant barrage of potential hazards. No wonder they're looking for more objective ways to assess the risk. So how have researchers been trying to understand these patterns and make those assessments more data-driven?
Well, researchers have been doing a lot of work to understand these strikes in more detail. One study, published in 2016 by DeVault and others, took a really deep dive into the data. They looked at the specific types of birds involved, the times of year when strikes were most common, the size of the bird flocks, how much the birds weighed, and the extent of the damage they caused.
So they really drilled down into the specifics, looking for patterns and trends.
Right. And it turns out that it's not just about what's happening inside the airport. The area around the airport can actually play a big role in attracting wildlife.
Yeah, that makes sense. Airports aren't exactly islands. They're part of a larger ecosystem.
Exactly. And the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, has identified a whole bunch of things that can make the area around an airport attractive to wildlife. Things like open parking lots, those bright lights at theaters, food waste from restaurants. Even golf courses can attract birds because of the water features.
So managing wildlife hazards isn't just about keeping animals off the runway, it's about being mindful of the surrounding environment and how it might be drawing them in.
Absolutely. And ICAO actually has rules, specifically Annex 14,
Hmm.
that require member states to actively assess and mitigate wildlife hazards around airports. They're pushing for a proactive approach, saying, hey, let's not just wait for something to happen, let's try to prevent it in the first place.
So it's a combination of keeping the airport itself safe and understanding how it fits into the bigger picture. But even with all these efforts, there's always the risk of a strike happening, and that's where technology comes in. This research we're talking about today, it focuses on how data analysis can help airports better understand and manage these risks.
Yeah, they developed this really cool web-based risk matrix tool, and they use some pretty sophisticated tools to build it. Tableau and R for visualizing the data, and Shiny for creating the interactive user interface.
Hold on, I'm trying to picture this. So Tableau and R, they're like the data crunching powerhouses, finding all the hidden patterns and trends in the massive amounts of data, and then Shiny takes that information and presents it in a user-friendly way, right? Like a website.
You got it.
Yeah.
So it's not just a bunch of numbers and spreadsheets. It's actually visually appealing and easy for airport staff to use.
And this tool, what's the main goal? Is it about giving early warnings, helping with risk assessment, or both?
It's about both, actually. The researchers wanted to create a tool that could give airports timely alerts about potential wildlife hazards, like, hey, there's a high risk of bird strikes this evening.
So like a heads up so they can take preventative measures.
Right. And the other big thing is that this tool allows airport staff to do their own risk assessments. But instead of relying on gut feeling, it uses a ton of historical data. We're talking about data going all the way back to January 1st, 2000, up to October 17th, 2023.
Wow, that's a pretty extensive data set. They've got a long history to work with. What kind of insights were they able to glean from all that data?
Well, they looked at a total of 258,218 reported wildlife strikes. That includes everything from near misses, where a plane almost hits an animal,
Yikes.
to incidents that caused minor or major damage to the aircraft. And sadly, there were even 58 cases where the aircraft was completely destroyed.
58. That's a stark reminder of how serious this issue can be.
It really is. And they found some interesting patterns when they dug into the data. For instance, when they looked at near-miss reports, the top 5 airports were all in Texas: Dallas-Fort Worth, Austin-Bergstrom, Houston-George Bush, Dallas-Love Field, and Houston-William Hobby.
Huh. All in Texas. That's interesting. I wonder if there's something specific about the environment or the types of birds in that region that contributes to that.
That's a great point. It's definitely something worth investigating further. And then, when they look at the types of birds involved in these near misses, even though a lot of the reports didn't say exactly what kind of bird it was.
So there's some missing data there?
Yeah, but the most commonly reported birds were mourning doves, rock pigeons, killdeer, and barn swallows.
A mix of common birds you might see around urban areas.
Right. And most of these near misses happen during the approach phase of flight, which makes sense. That's when the plane is closer to the ground and more likely to encounter birds.
Right, the critical moment before touchdown. Okay, so that's near misses. What about incidents that actually caused damage, even if it was minor? Did they see any geographical or seasonal patterns there?
Yeah, for incidents that caused minor damage, they had 6,013 reported cases. And this time, California, Florida, and Texas were the states with the most incidents.
So different hot spots emerging for different types of incidents?
Yeah, it's interesting how the patterns shift. And they also noticed some seasonal trends. April and October were the months with the most reports of minor damage. And as for specific airports, Sacramento International had the most incidents, followed by Salt Lake City, Orlando, Dallas-Fort Worth again, Denver, and Chicago.
So a mix of busy airports across different regions, some overlapping with the near-miss hotspots.
Right. And then, when they looked at the types of wildlife causing the damage, they actually found some pretty big differences depending on whether it was day or night. During the day, the culprits were mostly gulls, red-tailed hawks, turkey vultures, and Canada geese.
Okay, so mostly birds, active during the day, as you might expect. What about nighttime?
Nighttime was a different story. The main culprits were white-tailed deer and, surprisingly, Canada geese again.
Deer at night. That's not something you'd think about much, but it makes sense given their activity patterns.
Yeah, it highlights that airports have to be on guard around the clock. Now, let's talk about those 58 cases where the aircraft was actually destroyed.
Those are the ones that really hit home, the worst case scenarios.
Absolutely. When they analyzed those incidents, white-tailed deer were responsible for the most damage, accounting for over 27% of those cases. And then it was Canada geese and bald eagles, each involved in almost 7% of the destroyed aircraft incidents.
So a mix of large birds and ground animals, highlighting the diverse range of threats.
And it's not just about the type of animal, but also where they're encountered. The deer strikes, as you'd probably guess, happened at really low altitudes, usually less than 9 feet above the ground. But the Canada goose strike that destroyed an aircraft, that happened at 8,800 feet. And the bald eagle strike was at 2,137 feet.
Wow, that's a huge range of altitude, showing that these risks aren't just confined to takeoff and landing.
Exactly. And when they looked at the types of aircraft operations that were most affected by these catastrophic trends, it was mostly business and privately owned aircraft. And the majority of these accidents happened while the aircraft was en route, followed by the climb, landing roll, takeoff run, and approach phases.
Interesting. So it wasn't just limited to a specific phase of flight?
Right, it seems like these severe incidents can happen at various points during the flight. And I can only imagine the financial impact when an aircraft is destroyed. I mean, we're not just talking about repairs here, it's a total loss.
Yeah, the cost must be astronomical.
It is. They found some pretty staggering numbers. LaGuardia Airport in New York had the biggest financial hit. A Canada goose strike there led to losses of over $49 million. And then there was Troy Municipal Airport in Alabama, where a white-tailed deer caused over $15 million in losses. And Astoria Regional Airport in Oregon had over $8 million in losses because of Owapiti, which is also known as an elk.
Wow, those are some huge numbers. It really underscores the economic impact these strikes can have on top of the safety concerns.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that this isn't just some theoretical problem, it has real-world consequences.
Okay.
Okay, so let's dive into how the researchers put this web-based risk matrix tool into action. They focused on 2 airports in California, Los Angeles International, or LAX, and Sacramento International, or SAC. Both of these airports have reported a lot of wildlife hazards, so they were good case studies.
So using real-world data to test the tool's effectiveness, how does this tool actually estimate the likelihood of a wildlife strike happening at a particular time and place?
Good question. So what they did was they took all that historical data on wildlife incidents, all those reports we talked about earlier, and they looked for patterns in when and where these incidents were happening.
So they're looking for those high-risk periods, the times when wildlife is most likely to be active near the runways?
Right, and they found that both LAX and SAC had the fewest incidents between midnight and 5 a.m. That makes sense because there are fewer flights during those hours, so less chance of a strike.
Fewer planes in the air, fewer targets for wildlife to encounter. But as the day goes on and air traffic increases, the risk also goes up.
Yeah, and here's where things got interesting. At SAC, they found that there was a huge jump in incidents starting around 5 p.m. and it peaked around midnight. So in Sacramento, the evening and early night hours were the riskiest times.
That suggests there's something specific about the wildlife in that area. Maybe they're more active at night, or there's something drawing them in during those hours.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, at LAX, they actually saw a different pattern. The incidents were more evenly spread throughout the day, with the biggest peak happening earlier, around 7 a.m.
So very different patterns for different locations really highlights the importance of understanding the local context.
Absolutely. So to make their risk calculations even more precise, they broke the day down into 4 periods. Midnight, from midnight to 5:59 a.m., morning, from 6 to 11:59 a.m., afternoon, from noon to 5:59 p.m., and evening, from 6 p.m. to 11:59 p.m.
So breaking it down into chunks to get a finer grained view of the risk.
Exactly. And they didn't just look at time of day, they also looked at seasonal variations. At LAX, they saw a dramatic increase in evening incidents from February to April, but the midnight incidents stayed pretty low all year round.
Yeah.
And at SAC, the evening incidents peaked in April and again in October.
Fascinating how the patterns change not just throughout the day, but also throughout the year. So much variation to account for. Okay, so that's the probability side of things. When are strikes most likely to happen? But what about the severity side? How does the tool factor in the size and potential damage caused by different animals?
Right, that's a crucial part. So for severity, they categorized the animals involved as small, medium, or large. They compared LAX and SEC, and they found that SAC actually had a higher percentage of strikes involving medium-sized animals. But both airports had the most strikes overall, with small animals.
Okay, so while those larger animals can definitely cause more serious damage, it seems like the sheer number of smaller animals makes them a significant threat too. It's like the smaller ones might be more likely to slip through the cracks, so to speak.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to consider both probability and severity. Now, here's how they combine those two factors into an overall risk score. Risk R equals probability P multiplied by severity S, and they assign numerical values to the severity categories. Small was 1, medium was 2, and large was 3.
So it's a simple equation, but it captures the essence of risk assessment. How likely is it, and how bad would it be if it did happen?
Exactly. So if there are a lot of strikes happening in the morning, and those strikes involve large birds, then you've got a high-risk situation. And the tool presents all this information in a way that's easy for airport staff to understand and use. They can select a specific airport and a month, and then the tool shows them a color-coded risk analysis for each time period in each animal size category. Green is low risk, yellow is moderate, and red is high risk.
Oh, that's clever. A simple visual way to quickly identify the periods of highest concern.
Right. It's all presented in a clear, interactive chart, so they don't have to wade through pages and pages of data. It's all right there in front of them.
So armed with this information, what actions can airport staff take to mitigate these risks? It's not like they can just shut down the airport every time there's a red alert.
Well, that's the beauty of this tool. It helps them make more informed decisions. For example, they can strategically deploy their wildlife management teams during those high-risk periods. Or, in some cases, they might even adjust flight schedules if absolutely necessary to minimize the risk.
Interesting. So potentially impacting operations based on real-time risk assessment.
Yeah, and they can also use this information to plan runway maintenance activities in a way that minimizes wildlife exposure. And they can even make sure they have enough staff on hand to monitor and respond to any potential issues.
It really sounds like a game changer for airport safety management, moving away from guesswork and towards data-driven decision-making.
Exactly. And the researchers have some really cool plans for the future. They want to make this tool even more powerful. They're talking about adding geographic location data so they can see if there are certain areas around the airport that have a higher risk because of nearby habitats. They also want to incorporate operational data, like when specific runways are being used, and they even want to include information about bird migration patterns.
So taking into account the movements of wildlife populations to predict when and where they might pose the biggest risks.
Right. They want to make this a dynamic tool that's constantly updating and adapting to the changing environment. Of course, building something like this isn't without its challenges. The researchers encountered a few hurdles along the way.
What were some of the biggest challenges they faced? Was it the technology itself or more about the practicalities of implementation?
It was a bit of both, actually. Data quality was a big one. Sometimes the reports they were working with had inconsistencies or there were gaps in the data, and that can obviously affect how accurate the risk assessments are.
Yeah, garbage in, garbage out, as they say.
Right. And then there's the challenge of integrating this new tool with all the other systems that airports use. You can't just create something in isolation. It has to work seamlessly with everything else.
Yeah, it's got to be part of the ecosystem, not just a standalone thing.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the human factor. You have to make sure that airport staff are properly trained on how to use this tool. And you also have to keep in mind that it's based on historical data. So if there's a sudden change in the environment or wildlife behavior, the tool might not be as accurate.
So ongoing training and constant updates are crucial. It's not a set it and forget it kind of solution.
Exactly. And they're still working on validating the system's effectiveness. Making sure it actually works as intended and can be scaled up for use at different types of airports. It's an ongoing process. But overall, this research is super promising, and they have some great ideas for future research directions. They're talking about incorporating meteorological data to see if weather patterns influence wildlife behavior and strike risks.
That makes sense. Certain weather conditions might drive animals to seek shelter or food in different areas, potentially increasing the risk near airports.
Right. And they're also interested in looking at the impact of noise abatement procedures, those quiet hours at airports. They want to see if that affects wildlife activity. They're also thinking about exploring how specific geographic features and local wildlife movement patterns can be incorporated into the risk assessments. And down the line, they're even talking about using machine learning to improve the tool's predictive capabilities.
So, taking advantage of the latest advancements in artificial intelligence to make even more accurate predictions about wildlife behavior.
Exactly. It's really exciting to see how data science and technology are being used to address this really complex, ever-evolving challenge.
It really highlights how innovative thinking can improve airport safety and ultimately protect lives. It's about being proactive and using all the tools at our disposal to stay ahead of the curve.
Absolutely. And it's easy to forget about this aspect of aviation safety when you're focused on, packing your bags and catching your flight. But hopefully, this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for all the work that goes into keeping the skies safe from those unexpected feathered or furry flyers.
Yeah, it's one of those behind-the-scenes things that most people don't think about, but it's absolutely crucial.
And just to bring it all back, remember that number we talked about earlier? Over 17,000 reported wildlife strikes in the U.S. in a single year. It's
Yeah.
a stark reminder of how often these encounters happen.
Yeah, and it really underscores the need for constant vigilance and these kinds of innovative solutions. It's an ongoing challenge, and we've got to keep finding ways to adapt and stay ahead of the curve.
So here's something to think about as you head to the airport next time. As air traffic keeps increasing all over the world, and as we keep building and expanding into wildlife habitats, how do we make sure that airports are both safe and environmentally sustainable? This question that's going to become even more important in the years to come.
It's a balancing act for sure, and if this whole topic has piqued your interest, I'd encourage you to check out the FAA's Wildlife Strike Database. It's actually publicly accessible and it's full of fascinating information. Or you could do some digging into the latest research on aviation safety technology. It's a constantly evolving field with some really cool innovations happening.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Until then, safe travels, everyone.
And watch out for those birds
And dear.
and everything in between.